Um, Imagine walking into a hospital, completely healthy, but leaving with a label that permanently changes how the world sees you.
Right. That is a truly terrifying thought.
It really is. You report hearing a voice just once, and from that exact moment on, every completely normal thing you do, like writing in a notebook or pacing a hallway out of boredom, is recorded by doctors as a symptom of severe mental illness.
Because everything gets filtered through that initial label.
Exactly. You're trapped in a psychiatric ward, and the only way out is to admit that you are fundamentally broken. That is exactly what happened in the famous Rosenhan study, and it is the perfect starting point for us today.
It really highlights how precarious these definitions can be.
Welcome to this deep dive. If you are joining us, you are likely navigating your coursework in the sociology of deviant behavior.
And, you are probably balancing your studies with jobs, family, and the everyday pressures of adult life.
So our mission today is to look at mental disorders not just as a medical issue, but as a profoundly social one. We are pulling from a comprehensive textbook chapter on mental illness, along with clinical context from the Cleveland Clinic regarding the DSM-5-TR.
Which is the primary diagnostic manual used in the field.
Right. So when we look at mental illness, are we looking through a microscope at biology, or are we looking through a wide-angle lens at society?
That wide-angle lens is the exact perspective you need for this material. As you study sociology, it is crucial to recognize that while there are certainly conditions with clear, measurable biological origins, our focus today is on functional disorders.
Functional disorders meaning conditions without a clear physical test, right?
Yes, exactly. These are disorders that currently lack a standard physical test, like a blood draw or a brain scan. Because there is no simple biological test, society is forced to draw the line between eccentric behavior and mental illness.
And drawing that line is an incredibly messy process, shaped by power, institutions, and inequality.
It really is. So to understand how society reacts to mental disorders, we first have to figure out how we define what a mental disorder actually is in the first place.
Figuring out that definition is where the immediate problem lies. If we try to define mental illness objectively, we run into walls almost immediately.
We definitely do.
Let us start with the statistical definition. This is the idea that mental health is simply a numerical average.
Right. So by that logic, whatever the vast majority of people do is considered normal.
Exactly. And whatever falls outside that statistical average is automatically deemed abnormal or an illness. But the flaw there is pretty obvious.
It completely ignores context.
Yes, a statistical definition only tells us what people actually do in reality. It tells us absolutely nothing about what people ought to do, completely ignoring social norms and the specific context of the behavior.
Which is why, sociologists and psychologists often turn to normative definitions instead, specifically Redlich's criteria.
Redlich's criteria being a more situational framework.
Right. This framework argues that behavior cannot be judged on a spreadsheet. It has to be judged in context. Redlich argued it depends on 3 specific factors.
What is the first factor?
First is the motivation behind the behavior. Washing your hands before cooking a meal is perfectly normal, but a compulsive, uncontrollable need to wash your hands 50 times an hour is viewed very differently.
Because the underlying motivation has shifted from hygiene to severe anxiety.
Exactly. Second is the situation itself. Wearing a swimsuit on a sunny California beach is entirely expected.
But doing that in a snowstorm is a different story.
Right. Wearing that exact same swimsuit while walking down a freezing Alaskan street in the middle of winter is considered highly abnormal. The behavior is the same, but the situation completely changes the social judgment.
And there's a third factor, right?
Yes, the third factor is who is actually making the judgment. Are you being evaluated by a qualified psychiatric expert, or are you just being judged by your neighbors?
But even when we rely entirely on the experts, the lines remain incredibly blurry. That brings us to the clinical definition, which relies on practitioner judgment and the criteria laid out in the DSM-5-TR.
People naturally assume this is the most objective scientific method available.
They do, but our source material points out some staggering historical inconsistencies. Consider the Midtown Manhattan survey.
Oh, that study is a perfect example.
In that study, researchers gathered extensive data on the everyday psychological distress of the population and handed it over to a team of psychiatrists for evaluation.
And the results were completely shocking.
They bizarrely concluded that 4/5, or 80%, of the entire population of Midtown Manhattan had a mental disorder.
80% is an unbelievable figure.
Right. If a clinical definition classifies almost every single person walking down the street as mentally ill, it raises serious questions about the validity of the measuring stick they're using.
It absolutely calls that measuring stick into question. What the Midtown Manhattan survey revealed was an ideal standard of mental health that was practically impossible for anyone to actually achieve.
It was setting the bar way too high.
Exactly. The clinicians were measuring adults who were managing the intense daily stresses of modern urban life against a utopian baseline of perfect psychological tranquility.
Which just does not exist in the real world.
No, it doesn't. It demonstrates how clinical judgments can become overly broad. When practitioners are specifically trained to look for pathology, they can easily interpret normal human struggles and distress as symptoms of a clinical disorder.
Well, if clinical definitions are this prone to subjective error and overreach, it forces us to ask who gets to write the rulebook in the first place.
That is the most critical question.
The DSM is not a periodic table of elements where scientists are discovering fixed, unchanging laws of physics. It acts much more like a cultural dictionary.
A dictionary that constantly updates.
Right. It updates to reflect what society currently values, what it tolerates, and, frankly, what it fears. The Cleveland Clinic notes that the DSM-5-TR is the main guide for mental health providers, compiled by hundreds of experts.
But our sociological sources emphasize that the creation of this manual is not a purely scientific endeavor.
No, it is deeply responsive to social and political pressure.
The history of the DSM provides clear evidence of how these social boundaries are negotiated and changed over time. For instance, the term neurosis was once a heavily utilized diagnostic category that applied to millions of people.
But we don't really use that clinically anymore, do we?
No, it was eventually dropped from the manual entirely. And not because the human brain evolved overnight, but because the psychiatric community decided the term lacked precise diagnostic criteria.
That is a huge shift.
It gets even more profound. An even clearer example is the classification of homosexuality. It was listed as an official mental disorder in the DSM until 1973.
And it certainly wasn't removed because of a new biological discovery.
Exactly. It was removed because of intense organized lobbying and social pressure from gay rights activists. They rightfully demanded that their identities no longer be medicalized and pathologized by the psychiatric establishment.
And we can actually see how political influence works in the opposite direction, too, to keep certain behaviors out of the manual.
Yes, the 1980s proposal is a great example.
Right. In the 1980s, a diagnosis of rapism was officially proposed to categorize the behavior of rapists as a medical condition. But feminist groups strongly protested the inclusion of this diagnosis.
Their reasoning was very pragmatic.
It was. They argued that giving this violent behavior a medical label might provide criminals with a built-in insanity defense in the legal system, allowing them to escape moral and criminal responsibility.
And the committee listened to them.
They did.
Well,
Facing this intense political backlash, the psychiatric committee quickly withdrew the proposal. It is hard to imagine a field like cardiology withdrawing a diagnosis of heart disease just to avoid a political controversy or a lawsuit.
that contrast highlights a fundamental concept for you to remember as you apply sociological theory to this topic. The boundaries of functional mental disorders are completely socially constructed.
We also see this in how culture actively dictates the specific symptoms of fear.
Absolutely. Our sources note that in some cultures, people develop a genuine, paralyzing fear of transforming into a cannibal.
Which sounds completely bizarre to an outsider.
It does. To a Western psychiatrist trained in the DSM, this might look like a severe hallucination or mere fantasy. They would likely mislabel it as an individual clinical disorder like schizophrenia.
But sociologically, it is something entirely different.
Right. Sociologically, we must distinguish between an individually generated delusion and a culturally induced fear. The culture itself provides the specific language and imagery that individuals use to express their psychological distress.
So if society and powerful institutions are the ones drawing these boundaries, what happens to your actual life and identity when you cross the line and receive an official label?
That is where things get very difficult for the individual.
This is where sociological labeling theory becomes incredibly powerful. The sociologist Thomas Sheff introduced a framework called residual rule breaking.
Which is a fascinating concept.
We all understand that society has formal, written rules like criminal laws against theft. But society also has a massive web of vague, unwritten rules governing everyday behavior.
Like how close you stand to someone in an elevator.
Exactly. There are unspoken norms about the appropriate volume to speak at on a train, the correct amount of eye contact to make with a cashier, or how long it is acceptable to stare blankly into space. Violating these leftover, unwritten norms is what Sheff calls residual rule breaking.
And the most fascinating aspect of Sheff's theory is the realization that almost everyone breaks these residual rules at some point in their lives.
I mean, I know I certainly have.
We all have. You might have a day where you are completely exhausted and withdrawn, or you might mutter to yourself while stressed out in traffic. Usually people ignore it or brush it off as just a bad day.
But not always.
No. Occasionally, someone is noticed, labeled, and subsequently typecast into the role of a mentally disordered person. Once society successfully applies that label, the real-world consequences are devastating.
The stigma is just so intense.
It is so intense that nearly 2/3 of people with diagnosable mental disorders actively avoid seeking treatment. They know that receiving the official label can immediately lead to job discrimination, housing rejection, and profound social isolation from their communities.
But wait, does the very act of trying to get professional help actually make that social rejection worse?
What do you mean?
Like, if you are struggling with your mental health and you proactively go to a hospital to get better, does society essentially punish you for seeking treatment?
Sadly, the sociological research indicates that society absolutely does punish people based on where they seek help.
Really? How so?
Our sources highlight a study that measured how severely society rejects individuals based solely on the type of professional they consulted for their distress.
Okay, so what did the hierarchy look like?
Well, the respondents judged the behavior least harshly if the person sought help from a clergyman or religious leader. The social stigma increased significantly if they saw a general physician.
That makes sense. Medicalizing it slightly increases the stigma.
Right, and it increased even further if they saw an outpatient psychiatrist. But the person carried the most severe, lasting social stigma if they had a stay at a psychiatric hospital.
So the building itself is the problem.
Exactly. The physical institution itself carries a massive cultural stigma, completely independent of the actual severity of the person's original distress. The label of mental patient becomes their single defining characteristic.
This also deeply affects how the person views themselves, doesn't it?
It completely changes their self-concept.
When society consistently treats you as broken, you often internalize that label. But our sources note this self-reaction varies significantly by culture.
How do Western cultures typically handle it?
Well, patients from Western cultures tend to see themselves as sick. They create a rigid separation between their illness and their core identity, adopting the formal role of the patient.
Almost like putting on a uniform.
Right. Other cultures might view the label in more integrated or spiritual terms. But in Western society, internalizing the role of the mental patient can trap individuals. It strips away their confidence and makes it incredibly difficult for them to return to their normal roles as employees, parents, or students.
Which brings us to a crucial question of vulnerability. Not everyone is equally at risk of being labeled, nor do they face the same environmental triggers.
We really have to look at the structural factors.
I do. We have to analyze how your structural position in society dictates your mental health. We can think of social stratification as a system that dictates how much stress you are exposed to and what resources you have to handle it.
And social class plays a huge part in this.
A massive part. When we look at social class, the data is stark and undeniable. Severe psychiatric disorders, particularly schizophrenia, are highly concentrated in the lowest social classes.
The numbers on that are staggering.
They really are. People positioned at the bottom of the class system develop schizophrenia at a rate 5 times higher than those at the top. This massive disparity drives a major sociological debate between two theories: social selection and social causation.
I want to make sure we clearly separate those two theories because they offer completely opposite explanations for this data.
Yes, they approach the problem from completely different directions.
So social selection essentially suggests a downward drift. It argues that a person develops a mental illness due to biology or genetics, and because of the debilitating cognitive effects of that illness, they lose their job, burn through their savings, and slide down the socioeconomic ladder into poverty.
So in that theory, the illness causes the poverty.
Exactly. Social causation, on the other hand, argues the exact opposite mechanism. It argues that the extreme, relentless stress, adversity, and lack of resources inherent in living in poverty actually cause the mental illness to develop in the first place.
The environment breaks the person.
Right. The poverty itself is the trigger.
And the weight of the sociological evidence strongly supports the social causation theory. The structural conditions of poverty produce chronic, inescapable stress that eventually overwhelms a person's psychological coping mechanisms.
We see these clear demographic patterns across other categories as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. Regarding gender, women exhibit higher rates of depression and bipolar disorder, while men show higher rates of personality and substance disorders.
But we have to factor in socialization there.
We do. We must note the socialization of help-seeking behavior. Women are socially conditioned to be more willing to contact medical personnel and express emotional vulnerability.
While men are pushed in the opposite direction.
Exactly. Men are heavily socialized to avoid seeking help due to the negative stigma of appearing weak, which heavily skews the diagnostic data.
We also see clear patterns with marital status, Unmarried, divorced, or separated individuals have significantly higher rates of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder compared to married people.
Which really points to the protective benefits of social support.
It does. And when we look at race, African Americans show higher rates of schizophrenia diagnoses than whites. But the textbook makes a vital structural clarification here.
This is a really important point for students to catch.
Right. This racial disparity is heavily tied to socioeconomic status and broader demographic inequalities. Because African Americans disproportionately experience systemic poverty and the compounding stress of structural racism, they are exposed to the exact environmental stressors that cause these high rates of active disorders.
So it is a structural issue, not a biological racial difference.
Absolutely. To truly understand how these structural stressors operate on a daily basis, we can look closely at a specific, intensive study conducted in the caseríos, or public housing projects, of San Juan, Puerto Rico.
That study is incredibly revealing.
Researchers evaluated lower-class married individuals, carefully comparing those who developed schizophrenia with those who did not, explicitly ruling out childhood trauma and genetics as the primary causes. They wanted to see what daily life actually looked like for the people who broke down.
And what did that daily life look like?
Well, what the researchers found was a crushing environment of extreme poverty and severe role conflicts. Think of it like playing a video game on the hardest possible difficulty setting.
Where your resources drain constantly just from existing.
Exactly. The women in this study faced intense cultural pressures regarding strict courtship rules and subservient roles in marriage. They lived in deeply crowded, chaotic housing situations with constant conflicts with neighbors and a complete lack of privacy.
That sounds incredibly draining.
It was. Most importantly, they faced a massive, unbridgeable gap between the standard of living they desired and their actual brutal economic reality. They could not afford basic necessities.
It was a pressure cooker environment.
It really was. The relentless compounding daily stress of these structural factors eventually led to deep mutual withdrawal and the onset of schizophrenia. It was not a biological failing of their brains, it was a structural crushing of their resilience.
If structural inequality and poverty systematically push vulnerable people to the breaking point, we must critically examine how society has historically managed these individuals once they break.
Which leads us to a pretty dark chapter in history.
Yes, the complex history of institutionalization and the subsequent movement of deinstitutionalization. In the 19th century, large mental asylums were originally built with a somewhat utopian rehabilitative goal.
They actually thought they were helping.
They did. The leading psychiatrists of the era believed that if insanity was caused by the chaos and stress of modern society, then placing people in a highly disciplined, peaceful, and orderly environment would simply cure them.
But the reality of those institutions quickly devolved into a nightmare, didn't it?
It devolved rapidly.
By the mid-20th century, these utopian asylums had turned into massively overcrowded, prison-like custodial dumping grounds. The staff were no longer treating patients, they were simply warehousing them to keep them hidden away from the public eye.
And the scale of this was massive.
It was. The population in state and county mental hospitals peaked at a staggering 558,000 patients in 1955. Entire towns were built around places like Pilgrim State Hospital in New York, which housed 12,000 people alone in deeply dehumanizing conditions.
Two major developments in the mid-20th century led to the rapid shift away from these massive institutions. The first was pharmacological.
Introduction of new drugs.
Right. In the 1950s, psychotropic drugs, most notably thorazine, were introduced. Psychiatrists discovered these drugs could effectively reduce severe delusions and make patients significantly more manageable.
changing the entire treatment model.
Yes, this created the medical belief that patients no longer needed round-the-clock confinement and could be successfully treated at home. The second development emerged in the 1960s as a powerful push for civil rights.
Because these patients were practically prisoners.
Exactly. Advocates rightly argued that patients were being locked away against their will, often for life, without due process. The proposed solution was deinstitutionalization.
Meaning, moving care to localized community mental health centers where patients could live independently and maintain their civil rights.
That was the goal, yes.
The goal sounded noble, but looking at the historical outcomes, I have to question the true motivations. Was deinstitutionalization really a triumph for civil rights? Or was it just a highly convenient excuse for state governments to save massive amounts of taxpayer money by emptying out expensive hospitals?
The sources paint a very grim picture of the reality that immediately followed the release of these patients.
The safety net just wasn't there.
The grim reality is that the community mental health movement fundamentally failed because the promised safety net was never actually built. State governments eagerly shut down the expensive psychiatric hospitals, but they completely failed to transfer that funding to the local community clinics.
So they just abandoned them.
Yes. The mechanism of failure was structural abandonment. Patients were discharged with a prescription for medication, but absolutely no housing support, employment assistance, or localized care,
Leading to a completely predictable crisis.
The direct result was massive urban homelessness. Vulnerable individuals who had been institutionalized for decades ended up living literally on the pavement, where they immediately fell victim to street predators, con artists, and extreme weather.
And without the psychiatric hospitals functioning as a safety net, society simply shifted the burden of management. We began relying heavily on the criminal justice system to handle individuals who actually needed complex psychiatric care.
It became a police issue instead of a medical one.
Right. Many homeless individuals with severe mental disorders turned to panhandling, trespassing, or minor property crimes just to survive the night. This led to a devastating cycle of police interaction and incarceration rather than medical treatment.
The jails became the new hospitals.
Exactly. Jails and prisons became the new de facto mental institutions. Today, the legacy of deinstitutionalization means we often see the stark reality of mental illness directly on our city streets.
And this highly visible presence on the streets brings us to how the general public perceives mental disorders today, which is heavily mediated by the screens we stare at every single day.
Media plays such a huge role in this.
It does. The sociologist Thomas Scheff notes that our popular conceptions of what it means to act crazy are not learned from reading medical textbooks or clinical journals. They are learned organically through everyday conversations, advertising, and mass media.
The media gives us the script.
Right. The culture provides us with the continuous, powerful script for exactly how deviance is supposed to look and act.
The media also actively drives the intense normative standards that directly fuel specific disorders. Think about the shifting standards of physical beauty.
The textbook highlights a really fascinating contrast there.
It does. It looks at a 1957 newspaper ad from Rochester, which actively promoted a much fuller, curvier body shape as the ideal standard for women. Contrast that historical norm with the brutal modern pressures faced by women today.
The Alicia Machado example is incredibly sad.
Yes, the text cites a specific example of Alicia Machado, a former Miss Universe. She faced intense global public scrutiny and was publicly humiliated by pageant officials simply for gaining a normal amount of weight.
And that kind of pressure has real clinical consequences.
It does. This intense, culturally determined pressure does not just cause bad days. It directly fuels the rise of deadly eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia. Individuals engage in extreme, self-destructive behaviors to achieve a physically impossible, media-driven body type.
We also see the media actively shaping our expectations of specific clinical diagnoses. For instance, the popular book and subsequent film A Beautiful Mind, which depicted the life of the brilliant mathematician John Nash, heavily influenced the public's understanding of schizophrenia.
It gave everyone a very specific visual reference.
Yes, but while the film successfully brought attention to the disorder, media representations require visual drama to keep audiences entertained. They focus heavily on the most dramatic, cinematic symptoms, like complex, highly detailed visual hallucinations.
Even if that isn't the typical experience.
Exactly. The reality is that these specific symptoms are not universal to all patients with schizophrenia, yet the public now expects them as the standard definition of the illness.
But the most damaging dominant media stereotype, by far, is the persistent idea that the mentally ill are inherently violent, dangerous, and completely unpredictable.
Which is statistically just false.
Right. The sociological and criminal evidence completely contradicts this narrative. People diagnosed with serious mental disorders are far more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators of it.
But the media keeps pushing the violent narrative.
Yes. Through news sensationalism and horror films, they continually reinforce this violent stereotype. This fuels immense public fear and deepens the social stigma against anyone carrying a psychiatric label.
And this profound public fear brings up a critical paradox highlighted by a major Surgeon General's report on mental health.
A paradox about information and stigma, right?
Yes. We live in an era of unprecedented information. If the general public has drastically more access to accurate scientific information about mental health now than they did decades ago, why has the social stigma actually increased instead of disappearing?
It is a profound paradox. We're taught that education eliminates prejudice, so more information should instinctively mean more empathy. Why doesn't it work that way?
The report explains that intellectual information alone does not conquer generalized emotional fear. Looking historically, the stigma surrounding an illness only truly drops when it is definitively proven to be strictly a medical and biological condition, rather than a behavioral or moral failing.
Can you give us a historical example of that shift?
A powerful historical example is syphilis. In its late stages, syphilis can produce severe delirium and behavioral changes. When society viewed it strictly as a moral failing of character, the social stigma was massive.
Because they blame the individual.
Exactly. But once medical science definitively proved the biological cause, a bacterial infection, and applied a direct medical treatment like penicillin, the behavioral stigma essentially vanished.
Because it was undeniably medical at that point.
Right, because the clear biological basis for many functional mental disorders remains unproven today, society continues to judge the behavior itself, maintaining the intense stigma.
Let us tie all these complex sociological threads together so you can apply them directly to your upcoming coursework, your exams, and how you view the world around you.
There is one core takeaway from all of this.
Yes. The main takeaway you must grasp is this. Mental disorders are undeniably real, and the suffering they cause individuals is profound. But the way we define, diagnose, and treat these disorders is a deeply social process.
It is entirely wrapped up in social structures.
Exactly. The entire system is shaped by political power, by influential institutions like the American Psychiatric Association, and by crushing structural inequalities like poverty and systemic racism.
As medical science continues to rapidly advance, we are left with a provocative thought for you to critically evaluate in your studies. If researchers eventually uncover clear, undeniable biological roots for the conditions currently classified as functional disorders, will the sociological definitions of deviance eventually disappear entirely?
That is a fascinating question.
Or is it a fundamental part of human nature to require an other-meaning society will simply invent new, unwritten, residual norms to enforce, creating entirely new labels for whatever behavior we decide is abnormal next?
It really makes you wonder.
It is a question that sits at the very heart of the sociology of deviant behavior, challenging us to constantly examine who holds the power to define reality.
It is exactly the kind of critical thinking you will need as you continue your studies. Keep that wide-angle lens focused on the structures around you. Audio generated by Notebook LM, reviewed, edited, and published by Professor Dixon.